Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Jen Ellis, and along with Benny Allen, we are the co-founders of AORA. There's some names that I recognize, a bunch of names that I don't recognize. So for those who do not know what AORA is, it's a virtual platform that we started in June of 2020. And it comprises a virtual space, events program, a members community, and a shop. And our whole aim is to bring together art, architecture, music, and more, with the aim of instilling a sense of calm, well-being, and discovery. So we are now on our third exhibition, which is thinking about bodies. So rather than being particularly formulaic, we've been trying to approach it from a very expansive perspective. And what you have joined tonight is part of our exchange program. So at the very, very core, we are passionate about bringing people together and cultivating a sense of community and having interesting and engaging lateral conversations about topics. So this evening in particular, what you joined is us and spaces. And I mean, it's so vague and there's going to be so much to chat about and deconstruct. But we have with us Oren Pinhassi. So Oren, hi Oren. Oren is an artist based in New York, and he's one of the artists who is exhibiting in AORA 3. And more specifically, he was one of the finalists, one of the 4 selected finalists for our open call that was focusing on sculpture. So we'll get into that a little bit later, but it's been incredible to show Oren's work. We then have with us Helen Pheby. And Helen is a curator. She's the head of curatorial program at Yorkshire Sculpture Park, amongst many other activities. And a point of connection is that, well, she was one of the jury members for our most recent open call related to sculpture. But we've done a number of projects in the past, and I should say that Yorkshire Sculpture Park was always a really big source of inspiration for Benny and myself when we were thinking about AORA, because we think it's one of the few places in the world that combines art, environment, context in such a thoughtful and harmonious way. So that's a little way of linking it back to AORA. And then we're joined by Spencer Bailey, who is a writer, the co-founder of Slowdown, based in New York. And I was recently introduced to Spencer, right, in the last 6 months. And as soon as I discovered the different projects that he'd been working on, whether it be writing about design, architecture, or with the media group and the various podcasts that he co-hosts, I was struck by his emphasis on long-term perspective, on how to approach it with a sense of purpose, a sense of slowness. And I was like, wow, this is at the core of the ethos of AORA. And if there's any way that I can rope him in, or we can rope him in to having a chat with us this evening or this day, depending on where you are in the world, that would be amazing. So, well, welcome to everyone. I think that's enough from me and enough of my introduction, but yeah, it would be wonderful to maybe kickstart by having each of the speakers introduce themselves. Oren, perhaps starting with you.
Yes, hi, thank you so much, Jen and Benny. And I'm so happy and honored to talk to Helen as well and Spencer. So yeah, I am originally from Tel Aviv. In 2012, I moved to the US to study at Yale School of Art in the sculpture department. And since I stayed, and I'm now based in New York, where my studio is and where I live. And I work primarily in sculpture and installation. And I would just say, maybe very, very briefly, what you're looking at right now is my recent show, The Crowd, that I did in 2 parts with participation of my gallery in London at El Santi. What you're seeing right now is images from the first iteration in St. Cyprian Church in London, which this show was, I mean, I hopefully will tell you more about it, but it was a bit intense because I arrived to produce it in London during the pandemic. So it started with a lockdown of 2 weeks, and I had a residency that I received from Outset Contemporary, and so I had a place to stay in a studio outdoors. It was some sort of a tent, a bit similar to those testing sites, and so I could isolate and work at the same time. And I have a lot to say about that, but generally my work is, I would say, somewhat somewhere between philosophy and architecture, and I would maybe expand on that later, but I'm thinking a lot about the kind of back and forth between humans and objects, or humans and things, and how what we design kind of design us in return, with a special kind of interest in thinking about potential future possibilities by looking at different paths. And maybe I'll leave it there for now.
I love it. You left us on a cliffhanger. But I think then it's amazing to then introduce Helen. Could you please tell us a little bit? I've dragged up some photos of Yorkshire Sculpture Park, and in case anyone needs some green undulating hills. I don't know if it's green up there. Right now in London, it's so grey.
Little chilly, little cold, little chilly. Yeah, thank you so much, Jen, for the introduction. So I've worked at Yorkshire Sculpture Park now for nearly 20 years. So I have a very good, rich understanding of that space and of that place. The poet laureate, Simon Armitage, we've worked with on a few occasions, has actually created a whole body of poetry around how YSP is independent kingdom with its own values, with its own almost laws. We occupy a 500-acre historic estate that we know has been occupied by humans for at least 1,000 years. So we can trace the history back through ownerships. It's been the site of various traumas, of various really positive events, so that actual land itself is very layered. The sculpture park began in 1977. It was started by Peter Murray. And at that time in 1977, the mansion house at the centre of the Breton estate, which is the estate we occupy, was a progressive arts education college. And it was founded post-war by Alec Clegg with this view, this philosophy that a creative approach to education really fulfilled every human being. So it wasn't necessarily that every child would be an artist or an architect, but that they would be a fulfilled human being, and therefore society as a whole. So this is the kind of philosophical context to how YSP began. And that's still very much the root of our ideology. And Peter started the Sculpture Park to bring the best of international art to a regional audience. And he'll say himself, in 1977, in the industrial communities of West and South Yorkshire, there was not a huge appetite for contemporary art. And that is something that's really grown and we've built. And I was really disappointed that I had my family tree done recently in my DNA thing. And all my ancestors are from West Yorkshire. They have not gone anywhere. There's been no spirit of adventure. But what I've learned from that, the positive of that, is this deeply rooted genetic connection to a place. And my PhD actually considered why all art isn't public. And one of the areas of research is that, so why isn't the National Gallery, which is a public building with a public collection, why is that not public art? And one of the areas of investigation was around space, what is public space, what is private space? I don't have any answers, after this amount of research, but it just kind of, it's a fascinating area of research. And particularly in the digital age, and now in the COVID and the post-COVID age, what are public spaces, what are private spaces? For me, we were just talking when we first came online, last March, my private space became my professional space through a digital form. And, all of that psychology of that, I think, is really fascinating. So I'm really looking forward to talking to everyone.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Helen. Yeah, spaces, private, personal, psychological, that's definitely something that I'm hoping that we can dig into, and those very various manifestations. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that's tangible. But without going into that too much, Spencer, over to you. It'd be amazing to hear about the multiple things that you do. And I'm just bringing up, in case people do not or have not subscribed to the newsletter or are listening to the Slowdown, you definitely have now a chance to jot it down and go off and look at it. But over to you.
Sure, thanks. So I'm the co-founder of the Slowdown. We're a New York-based media company. As Jen mentioned, we produce a newsletter. We also make 2 podcasts, Time Sensitive and At a Distance. I started the Slowdown about 2 years ago in 2019 with Andrew Zuckerman, who is an artist, a photographer, a filmmaker, a creative director. I'm not sure he would classify himself as any of those things, but I'll try to define what he does. Really brilliant mind and incredible partner. And we both had mutual frustrations about the state of media, kind of felt that there had to be a healthier, more sustainable way of doing things, and that there could be a platform for bringing together all kinds of disparate thoughts and ideas that are in the ether from various fields like art, economics, philosophy, design, architecture, politics, science, technology. And by bringing those things together in a deep, comprehensible way, one that was also not pretentious or felt inaccessible, was like a main goal of ours. And so it's sort of like, how do you create context and clarity around some of these, some of the most pressing issues of our time? And I guess if we were to have a sort of Venn diagram or a sort of way of thinking about what we do in simple terms, it's sort of a merging of culture, nature, and the future. And that's the prism or the lens through which we look at everything. We describe what we do as short form content with a long view. And it's sort of this idea of reframing how we think about time in the first place. Like we do make an hour-long podcast. A lot of people would say that's not very short. But I actually do think of that as short form if you think about the scope of one's day, one's life. And as long as you're delivering something that packs a punch, something that's thoughtful and really crafted, then an hour is actually short to kind of engage with something like that. We make a weekly newsletter. It's organized around the 5 senses. So see, touch, hear, taste, smell. And we highlight different things that we think people should be paying attention to under each sense. It was sort of strange as you know, COVID and the lockdown happened, being a company called the Slowdown, I started to joke that, you know, as time went on, we found ourselves definitely not slowing down. So it was sort of this idea that the slowdown has not slowed down in the slowdown. And it was also thinking about, you know, in the context of what we were making, a lot of our content is about engaging both sort of internal space and external space, making the digital physical and the physical digital. And we're all stuck at home. And so I think sensorially, we've all been thinking about our relationship with the senses and with space quite differently. So I'm sure that'll come up in this conversation. I guess maybe relevant to the context of this conversation as well in terms of space. I'm on the board of the Noguchi Museum here in New York, in Queens. Like the Yorkshire Sculpture Park, a really beautiful space that combines nature and sculpture and environment, and in a really sort of elevated, almost like visceral response kind of way. I'm also the editor-at-large of the publisher Phaidon, for whom I recently published the book In Memory of Designing Contemporary Memorials, which features more than 60 memorials around the world, documenting or reflecting on events such as war, genocide, terrorism, famine, slavery, very complex subjects, and looking at memorials specifically from My Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial to the present. So that's sort of brief version.
Amazing. I mean, I think it's all really, really inspiring. And one thing that I do want to highlight is what you're saying about spaces and the senses, this is something that Benny and I have been thinking a lot and also speaking a lot about. I mean, as a background, I'm a curator and a gallerist, and Benny is an architect. And so when we were thinking about how we're building, not only in this world, but in the digital world, we were thinking, okay, well, A, how do we do this with soul? And B, how do we activate the senses so it's not just seeing, but also, you know, hearing, touching, and so on and so forth. But that could be a whole other topic in itself. So I think that what would be really, really great, because it is quite a vague title, Us and Spaces, is maybe just to break things down a little bit and work with some open-ended definitions. Like, what does space or what does spaces mean to you? You know, I think that there can be a lot of confusion. Like right now, I'm obviously in a space, but there's all these multiple layers that just come up even in the course of this introduction. So maybe, Oren, you could tell us a little bit, not to put you first on the spot, but you know, what you understand by spaces. What is it what does it mean to you? And I'm just going to stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, so it's a big question, but I'll try to maybe tie it to a little bit to things that I've heard and in this conversation, and maybe a little bit the time that we're in right now. So, you know, for me, I think that a lot of my work is motivated. I'm saying was, I'll explain in a second what I'm saying was, but is motivated by basically investigating kind of archetypal spaces. And I had different types of spaces through my work. One of them was when I was still back in Tel Aviv, I was thinking a lot about the status of land and architecture and Spencer said something about memorials, and I was thinking about the status of architecture as almost every architectural building is, in a sense, could be looked at as a form of memorization or memorial. You know, this status of land where if you dig in the land, you can start a war, that's very different than the status of land in maybe other places on the globe. So I started in that place where thinking about archetypes like a bunker, an open tomb, and later on I moved to the United States, and you know, I started to kind of think more about my own identity and sexuality, and was starting to be interested in places like the bathhouse, later on the garden. And so I'm kind of, I'm using those as these examples of interaction that is both symbolic and material between humans and the environment that they create. And in return is, you know, dictating how we eat and how we sleep and how we have sex and how we protect ourselves, and whether protecting ourselves mean oppressing others or not. So I became really, really interested in, you know, what I thought was disappearing from the creative field, which is something that was very strong in modernism, which was this kind of like, you know, utopian tendency to try to imagine what society could be or could look like, and in many ways failed because it was excluding many people and many types of identities. And I think that trauma of that failure lasted for a very long time, where people in art, and I think also architecture, were mostly deconstructing. And I think that kind of opened up a gap in which mostly tech kind of took the reins and dictated for us a lot of the ways in which we live now. And so in many ways, kind of like going back to trying to imagine future through examining architecture and space and the way that it influenced our lives, it became kind of the center of my practice. And so, you know, kind of, I was kind of developing this logic of an erotic construction, or construction that is guided by an erotic logic. What I mean by erotic logic is if you imagine an erotic situation between two people, there must be a certain loss of boundaries between the bodies, but also between me and the other. And taking that logic of loss of boundaries, I developed these installations in which one time in relation to the garden, one time in relation to the bathhouse, categories like nature and architecture and body and furniture and body and architecture kind of dissolve. And so vegetation becomes architectural, furniture becomes a body. And of course, those existing in the history of art and architecture, for example, in the Gothic, a lot of the modern binaries doesn't exist. So, and maybe just to say one more thing about the time we're now. So, if a lot of my work was thinking about the growing abstraction in human interaction, and trying to kind of maybe suggest something else, all of a sudden, I think that, so I'll tell just a very brief anecdote of the Armory Fair just before. It was basically kind of, it's crazy to think about right now because it was when we were still not aware of the scope of this pandemic. And it was, I think it was the last art fair, international art fair that happened. And I showed a larger piece with Adela Santi, which was called Stalls, which was this kind of room divider made out of glass and transparent glass and plaster and sand that imitate concrete. So this modernist combination of glass and concrete. And then these pinkish, kind of flashy, abstract bodies that were standing on different sides of this partition. And one figure has this kind of breast sticking out from in holes in the glass, and one figure had its butt kind of sticking out of the glass. And with this work, I was thinking so much about these objects or architectures of separation between bodies, and how those are so much has to do so much with the fear of the body of the other, and by using the transparent glass to kind of like reverse that into desire. And so, and then during the pandemic, in the brief moment that there was indoor bar or pub kind of hangout, it was very, very, very brief. I went with some friends to Julius, which is a gay bar, queer space that is famous for the role it took in Stonewall. And I was kind of shocked because the partitions, and I don't know in London, but in New York, many, many bars use shower curtains, transparent shower curtains, as dividers between the tables. And I was sitting there and seeing this like roll of shower curtains, and kind of you see the reflections of people through these transparencies. And in my work, I used a lot. I use those references a lot, like shower curtains, and the way that you can think about this very, very private, very, very vulnerable object that has to do with your nudity and your body, and how that is related to maybe the glass of corporate buildings and the way the transparency is thought there. And so just to wrap it up, I was just kind of struck by how much, especially in that queer space with the history of AIDS, those shower curtains were kind of both the fear of contamination, the fear of the body of the other, but also what exists in a beautiful way in queer architecture, which is this voyeuristic gaze, the lust, the desire, that by having a separation, you actually want to transgress it. So I hope that's answering the question more or less, but.
It does. I mean, it brings up a lot of thoughts, right? I mean, I think you've plunged us into the deep end, by thinking when it comes to spaces, right? It's the body, right? You're thinking about like pure physicality, right? And it's your skin, it's what moves, but it's also feelings, right? It's emotions, it's desire, it's sensuality, it's connection, right?
Yeah.
Either getting it, developing it, not having it, and how on the one hand, you know, it can be an enabler of connection, but on the other hand, it can be a dissolver, and it can be a separation of connection, right? And I think that's really interesting as a springboard to be thinking about, you know, spaces in general, which, you know, actually kind of makes me think, you know, what Helen was saying about not all spaces, you know, being public, right? Especially if we're talking about the context of intimacy, right? Which is effectively also what you're touching on, right?
No, yeah, that's exactly. I was also thinking about it as Helen was speaking, and you know, I think that there is also this question of. I was just before the conversation, I was thinking about this parallel between law and philosophy, and architecture and sculpture, and the way that I was thinking about it was, you know, if law is something that affects people's lives immediately, and philosophy is something that is debatable, right? Whether it does, but I think most of us at least would agree that eventually it does. It can take a century, but it does. And in that sense, you know, I was thinking about art as a bit similar to philosophy. So it doesn't affect our lives immediately, but it does have the potential through, you know, thinking about spaces, thinking about what we create and how it kind of affects the way we live. And sculpture, I think, has this really special status because it's made in the same ways that we make other things, same technologies, same economies, and also we experience it through the body very, very directly. And space has a huge impact in that. And I think, you know, a sculpture park, for example, is a really special version of that because it does confront you with the real questions of weather and, you know, questions, architectural questions and environmental ones, but it still allows you to be free in the sense that you're not actually building something for someone to live in. So I think it's kind of, occupying this special place.
I've just realized when I think of space, I think of open air and sky, and that the architecture is something within that space. So we have some very beautiful buildings. But when I'm thinking, you know, the first thing I think of is sky and how you experience sculpture. So curating 500 acres of landscape, you are considering how people will approach that from half a mile away, and how they get the backdrop of that then of a town which is 10 miles away. And it's a completely, you know, it's a very different experience bodily than experiencing a sculpture in a gallery. And so when we've taken some pieces from a gallery exhibition and then they've stayed on longer term loan and gone in the open air for Noguchi, for example, Spencer, the difference of that experience of that sculpture. So in a gallery space, it's perhaps much more imposing. And it seems bigger. So like I've been convinced sometimes that our technicians have put different sculpture because I'm like, no, it's not the same. It's, you know, it can't be. And so that experience, so there's that physical experience of that space and curating that space, and every artist and every artwork changes that space. So it's constantly evolving, it's never fixed. But every visitor that comes to that space is also changing that space through their lived experience they're bringing to it and how they're encountering that landscape and the memory they then leave on that space. So I'm also really interested in that political side of whether spaces are for everybody. So one of the things that really appeals to me about the Sculpture Park and what we do is there aren't as many physical barriers to appreciating the art there as there are in perhaps some more traditional architectural spaces where you've got the steps that go up, which are really intimidating, and you know you're coming into a space that's really important. And so, yeah, I just find all of that, unpicking all of that and the elitism that's been associated historically with those buildings of culture, which still people find really problematic, although all this dismantling has been going on for years. There's still, you know, this sense that those spaces are not for them, that people don't belong in those spaces. So that's kind of my thinking around space right now.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting what you're saying about not for them. That's something that, you know, Benny and I have been thinking a lot about in the context of the fact that you can access AORA, a virtual space, via the internet, right? So, you know, there's this thought process that you can access it no matter where you are, so long as you have an internet connection. Now, that in itself, that last sentence is also problematic because obviously not everybody has an internet connection, but yeah, the accessibility and the politics around space, I think, is really, really interesting and really important.
Some
But
research that was done in Yorkshire around why people didn't go to museums and galleries was because they didn't know how to behave in that space. So when you're creating access to people, they could be laid on their sofa, looking on their phone.
yeah,
They're immediately much more comfortable, and they don't need to have a set of behaviors about interacting in that. And I think that's amazing with what you're doing, is it's just immediately there for people.
yeah. Well, without thinking, I mean, without getting too philosophical, but you know, you think of Foucault and you think of like the, you know, panopticism and so on and so forth, and this is, you don't have this idea of people looking at you the way you're looking, right? You're literally just interacting with it, you know, as one would, which is definitely something that, you know, has come to mind. But you know, I think Spencer, it'd be really interesting to hear from you. You know, when obviously you're dealing with, you know, spaces in so many different ways. But you know, what are the ways that you see it, or that you engage with it, or what do you think?
Well, space for me is, I mean, as it sounds like it's for everyone in this conversation, such a vast topic. I immediately think of outer space and the cosmos. I mean, I'm thinking of like space in a much more vast lens, but I'm also thinking about it in a very intimate way. Like I'm sitting on a couch in my apartment looking at Zoom right now. There's a painting over there and a ceramic piece, and so in my view of space right now, I'm looking into people's homes. I'm looking, I'm looking at a screen. So there are different layers here between the physical and the digital. I think when we think about digital space, one of the things that's interesting is that there are a lot of, to go back to this conversation between the sort of intimate and the, let's say, public or less intimate, that there is that dynamic happening at play in very extreme ways online now. And I think that there, in a way, it's almost like you have to teach yourself how to navigate that. I mean, Cal Newport with his book Digital Minimalism is all about that. Like, how do you engage an online environment as a quote minimalist, or that sort of thinking. And I'm most interested though, I mean, we could go into the digital, but I'm most interested in talking about the physical world, the material world. I think this notion of sites of engagement and memory, which is something both Oren and Helen touched on, is that, you know, when you're talking about, for example, like a memorial, we could take Mylan's Vietnam Veterans Memorial or Reflecting Absence at the World Trade Center. These are sites that really encourage you to slow down, where materials actually cause you to have a visceral or a physical response, and where there is emotion, meaning, history, context a lot underlying the physical. I saw someone mention Juhani Palasma's book in the chat here, and it's called The Eyes of the Skin. I recommend everybody read it. It's one of these books that really gets to the nature of sort of, I mean, it's in the name. It's this idea of like you're touching with your eyes almost.
Yeah.
There's you have skin sensations at these kinds of when you're interacting with space in this sense. I've been working on a to be announced project with Sir David Adjaye around the idea of alchemy, and for me, the notion of alchemy is fascinating because it talks about material culture, but it also talks about culture at large, how geographies and climates come together, cultures and societies come together, materials, how they manifest all of that meaning when you can combine them in a certain way, as Oren is even alluding to in a lot of his work. And I think when you can strip away a lot of the noise that happens when noise is maybe not the efficiency that exists in the world now, from construction techniques to how easy it is to put up a website or make a page. Like, I hope that's making sense, but it's this sort of idea of like everything's become so efficient that oftentimes to make something it loses its meaning. Like the meaning comes in the thoughtfulness, the craft that's underlying it or behind it. And so, and maybe I sound like I'm rambling at this stage, but it's like how you go from some sort of really vast notion of space, of outer space,
Yeah.
how digital is this other sort of portal. There are these physical realms, and when combined, it's all kind of shaped by us, the person, how we view the world, how we think about the world, and what we choose to engage with is actually the space. That's I guess the simple way of what I'm trying to say, is that the space is actually what's in what we choose to put in our view, or societally, culturally, where we're positioned, what our view of the world is. That becomes our relationship with space.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you said you're going to, going out in orbit. It's the wider cosmos. I come from a family of theoretical physicists, so that was not my first thought, but I'm like, yeah, I see that. But then, actually, if you want to take it, then I kind of felt that when you're in your description, and it resonates so much. It's like this macro to micro, right? And this paying attention to detail, right? It doesn't have to be as micro as particles, but I think just paying extra attention to things.
It makes me think too about. I once interviewed Stefan Sagmeister, the graphic designer, and he talked about. He did a book on beauty that came out a couple years ago that I highly recommend, and he said that. Basically, if you're not surrounded by beauty, you're becoming an asshole. And I actually thought that there is quite a bit of truth underlying that, like that we need to actively seek beauty in our lives. That I think it's actually a very important thing to maintaining a healthy understanding of who we are, how we got here, where we're going, what our place is in the world, and that being surrounded by beauty actually really does have a profound impact on us psychologically.
Can I just add into that, because I think it's a really interesting subject. I've been fortunate to work on some preschools, so designing buildings for children, and I did a bit of research which was about the environment being the third teacher. So children learn through three main interactions: their parents, the relationships they have with others, and then the environment. So I think what you're saying is entirely true. I would sort of counter what you say about you try to shape the environment, because ultimately when you're a child, the environment shapes you. So I think that there's probably a point where you can search for that beauty, but ultimately when you're growing up, you don't have that choice. So one of the things that I did through designing these buildings was to promote discovery, so that they can sort of have a sense of discovery within those spaces, so that then they can have ownership. And through that ownership, they then get a sense of belonging, which ultimately leads to well-being. So I think that what you're saying is really, really interesting. And I think
there's a whole field of study that's being developed right now around neuroaesthetics.
Yeah.
The Arts and Mind Lab at Johns Hopkins is probably the chief organization doing this. This woman, Susan Magsamen, is the founder and creator of it. And they're actually doing a lot of early developmental studies of children, particularly children who end up in comas, and they're studying the children as they come out of comas, how they interact with space. So they are actually designing spaces based around beauty and interconnection with nature, so that's sort of like maybe almost a sort of rebirth, a sort of way of coming back into the world, and the profound impact of that space.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you bring up that relationship with neuroaesthetics. I mean, without going too much into it, but the birth of AORA was actually from an episode that I spent in hospital, and I noticed that there was art on the walls, but there were none of corridors, but none in patients' rooms, and so I went deep into my research of the impact of like art and beauty on alleviating mood, improving one's mood, reducing stress, and so on and so forth. And it's really, really, really remarkable. And actually, I mean, a slight plug, but this week, Frame magazine released their new platform, New Visions of Wellbeing issue, and we were one of the 3 platforms included. And it's very interesting because it's how you can recognize art, architecture, or maybe other spaces as a place that has an impact on how we are, not only physically but also mentally, which is absolutely crucial, right, in these times. And something I have been thinking about is like how at least my personal definition of space and how I relate to space has changed over the course of the last months. I mean, of course, it develops, I think, with you as an individual, as you grow, as you develop your own sensitivity to the world. But I think it's been particularly accentuated in the last year, and how there's multiple planes. And I wonder whether, I mean, I'm sure it has, but whether there's been an evolution, whether it's been a slow or gradual, where there's been a sharp shift in the way that you perceive and approach this idea of your relationship to space over the course of, I guess, the last few months, what we've all been collectively living. Perhaps, Oren, if you have any thoughts, or anyone who wants to grab it.
Yeah, well, there was definitely a change for me. And, in many ways, it was mostly kind of like, it felt like everything that I was thinking about, the growing abstraction in human interaction that is mediated through the media and algorithm and technology, the increasingly fast pace of information that makes it difficult for us to kind of create meaning out of certain realities. It mostly felt like it all just came true. But if before I was trying to, kind of fantasize about the, not necessarily utopian, but, the kind of positivistic or neo-constructivist kind of like vision, all of a sudden there was the Dark Ages nightmarish version happening. And so, that, but at the same time, speaking about slowing down, I think that ability to completely stop for a second was just amazing, because I'll speak about myself. I never thought that that's possible, to put a wrench in the machine, in the wheel, but it did happen. And I think that in some ways it was kind of like a big reshuffle or reboot, or at least it allows that kind of like thinking. And so if before my work was kind of an attempt to create these full environments where there is vegetation that becomes architecture, and body and furniture, and ready-mades that kind of hint to mass production, but also are the most intimate objects that, Spencer was talking about, this haptic knowledge of things without touch. I think a lot of my work is kind of using that knowledge of, we know what a towel is because we soak the liquids from our bodies all the time. So what happens when that becomes a construction brick or a snake? We know the like kind of transparency on the glass in our shower when it's steamy. And also we know that in a public space, in the spa, and we also know what a reception window in the bank is, and they're all glass, but they mediate such different interactions. And so once the pandemic happened and specifically the lockdown, I think, this idea of the fear of contamination, but the way that it also has to do with desire and the question of pace and speed, they all kind of came together to like a huge crescendo. And I think it allowed me to, for the crowd, kind of concentrate instead of the whole environment just on body and architecture. Mm-hmm. And the kind of thought that I had was that it's no longer body in architecture, but it's body as architecture. So there is a complete marriage between our private space that is usually an envelope, but actually never is just an envelope. So I think I was interested in closing further the gap between body and architecture. And so it's these figures that are architectural and they have all these elements, like in Magistrate, for example. It has a glass head that is this echo chamber. It's closed in the back and it has this arched opening in the glass. And so I kind of referenced these bureaucratic architectures, ones that are designed traditionally to exchange information, but also to separate between bodies, mostly out of fear or the illusion of order, and kind of what happens when that opening that usually exchange money or letters becomes the mouth, or what happens when the head is this transparent glass that you can see through, or what happens when a male slot is where the genital usually are. So I think that there's just so much to say, and also the whole history of AIDS and the kind of history of queer architecture and culture responding to that, this like meet between desire and the fear of the body of the other. So it definitely it's still something that, to be very honest, I am still very confused, and also in many ways not, because really it was kind of like when I'm sorry if it's a bit weird, but when a pimple comes out, it's on the surface, but the reason that it came out was already there. So in other words, like it's a symptom of something underneath the surface. So I do think that it was surprising to me how much of the things that I was interested in came true, but they came true in kind of like the darker version of it. And I'm right now having this strong debate with myself, can I already go back to being positivistic and fantasize this like erotic construction, this non-binary spaces, or am I still wanting to allow myself to really look at the extreme situation we're in, the extreme situation that our bodies are in. And so I think I'm still there, but I'm just, I'm curious also. I think it's a great opportunity.
I think putting that word curious at the end is really important, and actually injects some injects some positivity and hope. Maybe positivity is not exactly the right word, but in something that can be otherwise very frightening. I mean, I really align with you, and I think we all do, when you have this idea of like how you put something in the wheel and it literally just kind of stops, right? I mean, I personally never thought that would be possible. It was a plane every other week or so on and so forth, but then somehow there's a creation of space to think. So there's a creation of another type of space for your mind and for thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
And no, I mean, Helen, how has it been from you?
I mean, one of the at some points I felt really claustrophobic about basically being in house arrest. That's what we are, and something that came to mind was some of the stuff James Turrell said. Well, we're really fortunate to have a James Turrell Sky Space at the Sculpture Park, about when he was imprisoned for finding the inner space, and that's actually infinite, and that, you know, and that does come to mind when experiencing AORA as well. I actually, although it's screen based, it feels immersive, and you feel like my heartbeat's slowing and that I'm paying attention and that things are slowing down. So that's that inner space, I think, is something that I've been spending quite a lot of time in. I'm actually going to find it quite difficult to get back out. Now I've got used to it. It's like, oh, what do you mean I can go outside again? I don't know. It's like there's wild animals that get released back into nature. I'm going to need like rehabilitating.
Yeah, I think that inner space, my gosh, I can really relate to that. And what about you, Spencer? Have there been shifts and turns on this road?
Well, it's interesting. I think I have to mention, I live on a ground floor apartment in New York City, which, but not in like a super loud neighborhood. That said, what's interesting about it is by living on the ground floor, I feel very rooted in the earth in a way that, say, if I lived up in a skyscraper or on the 10th floor of some building and had to take an elevator, I would feel separated from. And so having to spend so much time in this ground floor apartment, I still feel very engaged with the city and with the environment outside. There's it's Chinese and Japanese notion called shake that I learned about through the Teresita Fernandez. And what shake is basically the extended view, this idea that you have a frame, and through the frame, there might be a rock garden and then some moss, maybe a bush, maybe a tree, and then in the far distance, there's a mountain. And what's interesting is like I look out my windows, and it's shake basically, but the city. So there's a bridge, there's a lamppost, there's the street, there's a pile of bags of trash, but it's all part of the view. And I think that that's what's been really interesting for me, is that I'm in my private space, but I'm still engaged with the life of what's happening outside. And this kind of connects also to what I was saying earlier about efficiency. And, you know, what's kind of sad about a lot of our cities is they're becoming banks and pharmacies and losing some of the texture and the soul of the space. And well, where do those decisions happen? On corporate boards, politicians, urban planners? Those are the people that really are shaping the world around us, and that built environment is shaping our lives. And so I think it's important to understand the power we have as a populace to be able to try and shape those thinkers who then shape the world around us. We only have so much control, but we can control what's happening inside. So I think that that's interesting. I've been thinking a lot about the architecture critic Sarah Williams Goldhagen's book, Welcome to Your World. I think the subtitle is actually How the Built Environment Shapes Our Lives. I think everybody listening to this conversation should probably read that book. And I've been thinking about it because it connects in a large way to the notion of animism, that energy is embedded in everything. And I love the notion of animism, and I think we too often forget it in our technological age. But it's why I'm obsessed with earth materials, and why I think I'm really interested in kind of like earth architecture, and Oren's work really connects to this. So that it's sort of fascinating to think about how we connect to the earth through material, which obviously also at Yorkshire Sculpture Park is, another central tenet.
Absolutely. I think the Noguchi exhibition kind of taught me that stone isn't permanent, it just has a different lifetime. But we see everything within a human lifetime, so something that actually has a lifetime of millions of years, we think is permanent. It's not. The earth isn't permanent, but yeah, I definitely learned that through that exhibition, which I'm really grateful for.
Yeah. it was making me think about linking back to material and texture and earth, and which is kind of, I guess, what's the essence of it all, right? And there was an interesting conversation that we had back in October, and it was all kinds of much more like techie people, and then there was this one moment where they're like, yeah, but behind everything there's people, and behind all people there's earth. Right, so it really comes back, let's not to lose sight of that. I am conscious of time because somehow it's now 6:59 in the UK, which means that we've nearly been chatting for an hour, which is always amazing. Was wondering if there were any burning questions. Otherwise, I'll leave it. If anyone has any immediate questions, please feel free to ask it. But okay, we've got a question.
Actually, there's a comment which I think is quite interesting to read, and it's in relation to what Spencer was talking about, and then I touched on, is that most spaces we use or encounter are inherited, and we've little control over how they look and feel. It's not really a question, but then Jeremy's replied to say, children do create environments. They constantly build things out of bricks. They make dens to hide in. They're constantly creating environments, which I think is really lovely. And then Mark's also said art cannot exist without architecture. Maybe that's something that we can touch on. I think, Helen, for you, how do you feel about that statement?
Well, art does exist without architecture. I mean, if it's from a point of view of the physics and the fabrication and what we've learned as human beings about physical objects in space through architecture, then I would agree with that. If it's that art cannot be experienced or does not exist as art without framed by an architectural setting, I would disagree with that. Although a landscape is an architectural setting in its own right, art exists as itself. It doesn't need that frame, it doesn't need a building. And Moore and Hepworth, who are kind of the touchstones of our collection, both really felt that their work existed in the open air in a natural setting. Hepworth said it could breathe, and Moore said he would rather have his art in a natural setting than any building he could imagine. So I'm not saying they're necessarily right, but I'm saying that art can exist without architecture, in my view. Otherwise, I'd be in the wrong job.
I would go a step further and also argue that sometimes that line between the two is completely blurred, and that that architecture can become art and vice versa. Mm-hmm. I'm just thinking too of unrealized projects as well, to go back to the cosmos and to reference Noguchi. One of my favorite Noguchi projects ever, unrealized, is Sculpture to be Seen from Mars. And he created it as a spatial experience, a sort of message to the outside world in following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it was shaped sort of as a human face. It was eyes, a mouth, a nose. And to think about space on those terms is quite fascinating. And it's certainly architectural. I would say, Michael Heiser is another example.
Yeah.
Who's sort of blurring the lines between what might be deemed architectural space and art.
Yeah, I mean, Michael Heiser, I feel is opening up like these floodgates. I mean, I remember when I was studying history of art, I was obsessed with land art. It was my favorite thing. There's all this merging. I received a question in private, and that's for you, Oren. If you could share with us a little bit more about how you achieve like the breaking down, the dissolution of private and public spaces, and also what spaces in particular the works in AORA reference. So I guess is the crowd.
Yes, thank you. So let me think. It's a big question just because the interaction between private and public is so much one of the central kind of dichotomies or binaries that I'm seeking to show how they can be dissolved or are dissolved in real life. But, you know, I think that for me, my work is based so much on the kind of history that materials already has in them because of the history of use, of human use. And in that sense, you know, I am responding to the most private spaces like a shower, a bathroom, you know, a bedroom. So I had beds and glass panes that refers to shower curtains or kind of shower glass in a shower room, towels, toothbrushes, and the reason I'm starting from that private space is because, you know, I really do believe that the greatest knowledge we have comes from our intimate use of things, and this exchange of something that you know we're in material exchange with it, not only use, but there is literally sometimes a material exchange, a certain alchemy between our bodies and the spaces. And also we influence so dramatically by the space we are able to live in, and spaces that, you know, other people design, but then our agency within that space. And at the same time, you know, I think that there are many ways in which what we call the public space or the ideologies of construction that are public really filter in to our private spaces. And in many ways, I'm trying to kind of expose those connections. So if before I gave this example of stalls or these partitions that are coming from, you know, these architectures of separating between bodies, like a bank teller or a voting booth, or, you know, I don't know, any kind of division that is designed to separate between me and the other. But then what happens when you merge that layer of glass that usually you interact with in a bureaucratic context, in a public context, and transform it into something that is familiar from your shower space, from the most intimate moment that you're vulnerable and, you know, and naked. And I think that for me is a suggestion to think about architecture, think about design as something that could be including those most intimate, erotic experiences and spaces. And you know, to go back to the crowd, I'll take another work as an example. There is what's called Duo, which is this kind of flashy structure that in a way has two bodies, almost separate but still connected, with a circular roof that is some sort of it's the head of the two figures, but also a roof that has these shower curtain hooks around, and the bodies are this booth on both sides, just big enough for one person to stand in. And you know, that work for me is kind of this combination between a public shower, but also the privacy of one body in one booth. It's also, as I said, this kind of like segregation cells or voting booth, or so to try to tie it around this work, you know, it's this kind of the story of this like impossibility of being one. You know, it's just like lovers that are in synthesis, are trying to separate, but also can't separate from each other. So in many ways, it's for me a metaphor of our dependency on the other. And once you kind of take that idea of, for example, the shower, which is one of the most private spaces, I would say, or intimate spaces, but then you think, what happens when you think about it in a public context, and not only public, but also bureaucratic or yeah, then that kind of synthesis is just one of the centers for the work and the crowd in specific.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, it makes me think when you're talking about, it makes me think of like governance, or to a certain extent, you know, even what Spencer was saying beforehand about, you know, you don't have control over, you know, the bigger things all at once, but there is these different structures that you immediately, I think of concentric circles, you know, going out, and like ripples of interaction and impact, and you know, the relationship between them. I'm going to be thinking about this now when I go about my daily routine. Like,
yeah, I mean, you know, I just want to quickly, you know, also just bring it back to that example from Julius, the gay bar in the West Village. You know, those. I think it's just incredible to see how restaurants dealt with the pandemic and the innovation of creating all these, you know, kind of improvised outdoor spaces that by now are a bit more organized. But the fact that so many of them use shower curtains as dividers, you know, was just one of these examples where the most private kind of object that actually, you know, is not so private because it's mass produced and it's produced under the same principles that are producing other more oppressive maybe structures. But the fact that that was being taken out of the context of the shower, the private shower, and put out to be experienced in public, I think there is something so transgressive about it that is just changing, you know, in a way forever the environment and the possibilities that we can imagine. And so I think that kind of loss of boundaries between the private and the public are amazing political kind of like seam that can produce hopefully you know, more sympathetic, more gentle or less oppressive kinds of design and thought about architecture.
I think that's really beautiful. And I think of compassion, right? At the very start of the conversation, you know, where we're talking with Helen, you know, about how professional, personal space has suddenly, there's been these blurred boundaries. Blurred boundaries is a lot. And, you know, whether that is a positive or a negative thing. And then just, you know, this reminder of just general like humanity, right? And then structures have been created in order to separate, but then how ultimately those same structures, whether they're actually physical, can just be all brought together. I'm now aware that people might have other things that they want to do with their time and their days, and you know, no matter where you are in the world. But I really, really want to thank all of you so much for this extremely interesting conversation. The fact that, you know, we've run over 10 minutes and there's still comments that are coming in. We know that it could go longer, but there is such a thing as Zoom fatigue and other things. So we'll give people back their days. But thank you so much, Oren, Helen, Spencer, for your time, for your thoughts, and just really infusing this conversation with so much care. Which is, you know, really at the end of the day what it's all about. And you know, for those who are either didn't know each other's practices, what we've been talking about, you know, please do go and follow Oren's work, look at what his gallery at Olasanti is doing, go follow, see what Helen's up to at Yorkshire Sculpture Park, what Spencer's up to, sign up to his newsletter, and, you know, please do have a look at what we're up to with AORA. We host weekly virtual gatherings. We'll be having a gathering next week about building a collection. The conversation will not be as flat as it potentially sounds, and with 4 different people from all different perspectives talking about different approaches. So that will be at 6 p.m. GMT next week. But otherwise, you know, our space is technically open to visit whenever, wherever you are. So thank you again, everyone. And to much more. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.